Hello, I'm back again. I'm going to introduce you to a real person from my childhood. His name is Muggs. This is called The Quitter. "I quit," Muggs shouted in defiance and slung his pitchfork with both hands, letting it loose to go spinning over and over far out into a meadow as far as his strength could propel it. He then pulled his blue handkerchief from his back hip pocket, wiped the sweat from his face, shook the handkerchief in the breeze by holding the two corners, and then neatly folding the handkerchief back up to its original form and returned it to its place in his back hip pocket. That same blue handkerchief coming from that same pocket become part of a ritual in sweat wiping, starting always by wiping his face, then the back of his neck, then under his neck, and then the inner rim of his hat, then holding the handkerchief up and looking at it for a while as if he expected to see a part of himself clinging to it. As a conclusion, always that precise folding of the handkerchief and the return to the hip pocket. The handkerchief seldom got laundried, as did the rest of his clothes. I have seen him wear the same clothes week after week with the same stains and soil markings on them. On a different occasion of seeing him arranging the tops of his socks, I could see the grime on his legs, which revealed his personal hygiene could be largely improved upon. Yet, Muggs always tried to give the appearance of having some hidden distinction, as if secretly we didn't really know who he was. His clothes were always properly arranged on him. The buttons were always properly fastened. His shirt collar was always turned correctly. His shirt tail was always tucked in straight, and his pants always fit him properly and had the proper cuff. His straw hat, the sort of which we all had to wear to keep the summer sun off of our heads, was a short-brimmed one, more costly and better in appearance than what the rest of us wore, and was religiously placed just right on his head. He had a special technique of placing his hat on his head, which he seldom altered. He would place his hat on his head with both hands, one hand on the back of the rim of the hat and one hand on the front rim of the hat. In this fashion, he would snug it firmly on his head. It was almost as if he were looking in a mirror and the whole world was watching or waiting for him to put on his hat. And once it was properly on, something would begin that would be wonderful. The rest of us completely ignored his actions. We kept our steady pace of loading hay on the hay wagon. Muggs' actions really weren't any threat to us, for the boss wasn't around, and Muggs was always so predictable and would soon be back to us. He was always going to quit, but never did, and we all knew that he would soon be retrieving his pitchfork, rejoining his station in life of loading hay. Every time that Muggs quit, he never quit in the presence of the boss. He always quit when the boss was away from the crew. As usual, Muggs stood quietly in the sun, for there was no shade trees available for acres, being ignored completely by everyone except the mosquitoes and the greenhead flies. After standing in the sun for a while, he emptied his mouth of its supply of chewing tobacco and filled it with a new supply. He didn't chew regular tobacco. He chewed the loose Prince Albert pipe tobacco that used to come in a little flat can. He offered me some one day, and I accepted, but the experience didn't seem to excite me. All the fine cuts of tobacco just went all over my mouth, and I didn't care for the tart taste. After replenishing his chewing supply, which seemed to be a sign of new courage, or at least a change of attitude, he retrieved his pitchfork and rejoined the crew. In a half hour or so, he'd be willing to share again episodes from his adventures in Europe during World War II, or talk about the trips he used to take in his old Packer automobile. If he were in a more up-to-date mood, he would describe how he lately seduced some woman. He had a favorite that he liked to tell about some daughter whom he was able to seduce, who kept telling her mother the little song ditty, "Mom, he's making eyes at me." The story always seemed incredible and full of contradictions if one wanted to question him on the validity of it. Part of the credibility was when he retold the story, he always smiled and reenacted how he made eyes at her. This he would do by opening his eyes wider than normal, lifting up his eyebrows, and blinking. The effect was too hilarious to be romantic, but my role was to be the role of listener, so I never questioned his story. I must have been a good listener, and terribly naive, because Muggs always shared stories with me. It took me 2 whole summers and every Saturday through the winter months for 2 years to realize that Muggs could be guilty of inexactitudes from time to time. The day I turned 14, I received my working papers and petitioned a local farmer for employment. He allowed me to join his hay crew, which worked all year harvesting salt hay which grew in the meadows along the shore of the Delaware Bay. The crew consisted of 2 brothers, Muggs and Oscar, and a young man who wasn't quite right but had enough wit to work in the hayfields if someone else were around, and myself. The pay was the going rate for farm help. $6 a day, beginning at 7 a.m., working to 4:30 p.m., 6 days a week, 30 minutes off for lunch. Everyone received the same wage. As I formerly said, it took me 2 years to realize that all that Muggs said was not exactly gospel, yet much of what he said was. He had been married once, but he never talked much about that. And it was in a tale that he was telling me about being in the Army for 4 years and having saved $37,000 in pay that I realized something was not exactly accurate. I broke my role as listener and questioned him on the validity of his good fortune and wanted to know what he could have possibly spent $37,000 on that he had to be working in a hayfield for $6 a day. I was about 16 at the time. He quickly went silent and engrossed his attention to loading hay. His brother from time to time, who couldn't always be kept from hearing Muggs' adventures, would remark on different occasion, "You damn liar." In knowing this, I always listened. As I look back on it, I guess I listened more out of respect and entertainment than belief, because Muggs was more than 3 times my age. There were little responsibilities, common to us all, that we had to do on the farm that Muggs did not like to do, and always found ways of getting out of doing them if the boss was not around. We had a machine that was designed to pick up rows of bean pods in a conveying fashion and dumping them on the rear of a wagon. The system worked for picking up short-cut hay. Muggs never liked working with the loader because it had a way of constantly dumping hay seeds and refuse on the person laying out the hay in the wagon. Oscar and I usually took Muggs' turn loading the wagon and letting Muggs drive the tractor that pulled the wagon that pulled the loader coupled behind it. More than once, the heat of the sun, the clanging of the machinery, the little demand of steering a tractor slowly down a long windrow of hay would put Muggs to sleep. He would go off course of the windrow and we would have to yell and wake him up. After another thing that Muggs hated was handling the grease apparatus. The apparatus took one man to hold the nozzle of the grease fitting to put on some part of machinery, and another man to pump the grease. There wasn't any way to work either the nozzle or the apparatus pump handle that you didn't get grease all over your hands and eventually all over your clothing. I think I understand Muggs' reluctance to get exposed to grease and grime because on one occasion I visited his home. He lived with his mother, father, brother, and sister. I really don't know what to call their home. It had a low roof with tar paper on it. It was about 7 to 8 feet in height and constructed of cement block with different concoctions of wood frame. The floor was dirt, covered with on-matching pieces of linoleum that had been supplied by random from the local dump. His mother, father, and sister sustained their part of the family economy by being trash pickers. The convenience of his home were a pitcher pump, one electric bulb on the low ceiling, and a wood stove that was supplied from a local sawmill. Some type of effort had been made to create room dividers from discarded wood slabs from the local sawmill. It gave a stall-like appearance. I never did understand how Muggs got his clothes clean on the occasions that they were clean, but his struggle to keep them clean was long and futile. The half-hour break that we got in the middle of the day for lunch was always predictable as to what Muggs and Oscar would provide themselves with for nourishment. On the first couple of days of the week, they each would have 2 bologna and cheese sandwiches and cocoa. And the rest of the week, they would have 2 peanut butter sandwiches and cocoa. I have at times marveled at the care and preparation that went into the production of their lunch. The quart thermos in which they shared their cocoa had continual stains and crustaceans on it from its much usage, but no evidence of hardly ever having been properly washed before reusing. Their sandwiches usually came in bread wrappers. They had lunch pails but didn't like to use them for some reason I'm not sure of. They commuted to work on bicycles and may not have liked the added burden of juggling and bouncing a lunch pail as they went to and fro from work. Neither had an automobile at this time. I have been amazed by seeing them produce their lunch on different occasions from their front pants pocket. This always caused the added task of straightening out the mashed sandwiches before they could be eaten. It is quite a feat to reassemble a sandwich that's been tucked in one's front pants pocket, but they mastered the art with no hesitation whatsoever. One lunch experience had involved all of us and centered around our boss. Some of his customers were in Philadelphia. On one occasion, he stopped at a bakery in Philadelphia and bought a loaf of pumpernickel bread. This bread eventually showed up in his sandwich. We usually ate under some shade tree, sitting around on the ground in a circle so that we could exchange stories as we ate, but this also meant we could eye each other's lunch to see who might have the most desirable looking one. The bosses always looked the best, lunch meat and fruit sort of thing. On this particular lunching, when the boss pulled out a black sandwich from his lunch pail and began eating it, we all had to know what he was eating. That day, our boss shared his lunch with us by giving us each a piece of a pumpernickel sandwich. We all agreed it was wonderful and even a bit exotic, coming from Philadelphia and all. Our only general store in town never had the need of carrying pumpernickel bread, so the experience to us was total enlightenment. To continue our education, our boss agreed to get us each a loaf of pumpernickel the next time that he would go to Philadelphia. But it would cost us 52 cents apiece. This was worth almost 1 hour wage, which would be 66 cents an hour. About 2 weeks later, he produced a loaf of pumpernickel bread for each one of us, and our next lunch together we shared in common. We all proudly ate pumpernickel bread sandwiches. Muggs and Oscar had their cocoa and 2 peanut butter and pumpernickel sandwiches. I still think that pumpernickel is wonderful and a bit exotic. Muggs came back to the wagon and continued to share in his responsibilities. But there was something deep down in Muggs that was troubling him, and he just remained silent and sober the remainder of the day. The rest of the week he was irritable and withdrawn. Then Saturday came, which was payday. The things troubling Muggs came to a head. He must have been talking to his brother at home, because his brother was in support of his actions. They both made a confederacy to approach the boss and demand more wages, or the ultimatum would be they both would quit and go somewhere else to get better wages. The paymaster was the boss's wife, and the process was simply going to the back door of the farmer's home every Saturday and receiving a check that would be made out and waiting for each one of us. On this particular Saturday, Muggs and Oscar, as usual, had walked their bicycles to the back step and were standing behind the handlebars holding their bicycles up. The boss received the checks from his wife, who was on the back door, and then passed them out to each of us. Then, when Muggs received his check, he asked to have a conference with the boss right then and there in the backyard. They had their conference. It was short and to the point. Muggs stated that the wage he was receiving was insufficient and that he and his brother needed more, or they both would have to quit. The answer was simple enough. They could find employment elsewhere if they liked, but they were receiving the going rate wage for farm help, and it would stay the same. Muggs and Oscar took their check, mounted their bicycles, and pedaled toward home. I didn't say a word, but I thought, well, how about that? Muggs finally quit. He really quit. I don't know how many times he quit in the Meta, but now this is official. He had finally made his move and demands and laid down the ultimatum and did it in front of the boss, the boss's wife, and the whole crew. I began to wonder who the boss might get to replace Muggs and Oscar and how it would affect my responsibilities. Following Monday, I was anxious to find out what changes would be in order for the coming day. I went to the usual place where the crew would meet in the morning to go down to the Meta. Muggs and Oscar were already there. Not a word was said about Saturday's ultimatum. Everyone but me knew that Muggs could not